It was supposed to be a liberating moment, a decision that would unleash the true power of the British economy and restore the United Kingdom back to the glory of its imperial days. But 5 years after London's divorce with Brussels, the benefits are yet to come. So, did Brexit make any sense at all? Join me to find out tonight here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. Our main story tonight focuses on Brexit, one of the most consequential political decisions of the 21st century. The UK's withdrawal from the European Union was the result of a promise made by David Cameron to hold a referendum over British membership in the bloc. He delivered on that promise, although he himself never campaigned in favour of the split. Almost a decade after the referendum, and 5 years after Brexit officially took place, the promise of restored British glory and international recognition is still to materialise. The supporters of the Leave campaign marched under the slogan of taking back control, mostly of the British borders, but also the state as a whole. Instead, they failed to reduce immigration numbers, made it more difficult for top talent to study and work in the United Kingdom, and introduced more, not less, red tape for British entrepreneurs exporting abroad. So, have there been any benefits to Brexit? We take a look at the British political landscape 5 years later in our report.
The morning of June 24, 2016, left the British political establishment in shock. Nigel Farage, then with the United Kingdom Independence Party, told the press that this was the Independence Day that Britain never had. He was celebrating the triumph of the Leave campaign and the imminent split between the UK and the EU. The vote was preceded by a rather bizarre campaign, in which members of the same cabinet supported opposing solutions. Michael Gove and Boris Johnson quickly established themselves as the main faces of the Leave campaign. They promised a major reduction in net migration and immense economic benefits. Farage referred to it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reform the country. Johnson, in return, referred to the EU as a failing project. In their view, the positive consequences of leaving the bloc were obvious and would materialize almost immediately. But 5 years after the separation, the reality is very different. Great Britain has only signed 4 new trade deals since leaving, all with its former colonies. The remaining agreements established with European countries were simply to replace trading provisions stemming from EU membership. Immigration is at a record high, almost twice as high as in 2015. The vast majority of immigrants come from non-European countries, mostly from Southeast Asia and Africa. British universities have seen a reduction in enrollment from EU countries and have lost many research opportunities. None of the trade deals brought a significant boost for the UK's GDP, as the gains were marginal. British small and medium enterprises are facing major export difficulties. And although 6 out of 10 British people think Brexit has been unsuccessful, it is unlikely that London and Brussels will reunite anytime soon.
Is there any hope for the mythical benefits of Brexit to still materialise? Who stands to benefit the most from the frustration of far-right British voters? And what is next for the United Kingdom internationally in this chaotic world of shake-ups and crises? These are heavyweight questions, so we brought heavyweight experts to try to answer them. Joining me tonight are Ivan Rogers, former UK Permanent Representative to the European Union, and Ryan Wain, Managing Director at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to Wider View.
Good evening.
Ryan, I want to start with you and ask you to establish a general picture. It's been 5 years since Great Britain left the European Union. Is there a consensus within the British society as to what Brexit brought about 5 years after, especially right now in the face of the recent geopolitical changes and the United States very much leaving Europe behind?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on tonight. It's a real pleasure to join you from the UK. There is a growing consensus, and it's probably not the consensus that the people in your film wanted. That's Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. There is consensus across the UK, 70% of the population, in fact, that Brexit and its implementation has failed. Britain has been stuck for some time now in a doom loop of low growth and high taxes. And it's funny that I'm speaking to you in a country in Poland where GDP is 3.2% in terms of growth. And in the UK, it's a measly 0.1% if we're lucky. So I think the implementation of Brexit has failed, and we are looking at how we reset that relationship moving forward. The good news, and it is good news, is that there's also a consensus across this country that people do want a stronger relationship with Europe. And I think there's also a belief that that strong relationship is there, and there's an interest on both sides, particularly, and it's a point that we're having this conversation in this week after Munich, particularly when it comes to key strategic issues like defence.
So, Ivan, over to you, and let's narrow it down. What is the narrative of Brexit and any benefits, hypothetical or otherwise, that it brought about within the founding fathers of Brexit itself, so the Tory party? What do Conservatives think of that move 5 years after?
Well, I think there is probably an increasing acceptance on the part of many Conservatives that implementation has been every bit as bad as you've just heard. And of course, the difficulty politically is you can't blame yourselves. Nobody wants to blame themselves for the botched operation or indeed the botched conception of Brexit. And everybody wants, therefore, now to argue that the opportunities were always there, remain there, but have been squandered by an ineffective government and sometimes deliberately thwarted by the permanent economic establishment around the Treasury, the Bank of England, the regulators, etc. So I think the Conservative narrative, and you're seeing the Conservative narrative move, if anything, further right towards reform, reform being Nigel Farage's new party, which is at the moment running ahead of the Conservatives in virtually every opinion poll. The Conservative narrative is Brexit was betrayed, we could have done so much more and better with it, we could have deregulated, we could have become more American, we could have become more mid-Atlantic. All of these opportunities were there and remain there, but have been squandered by the permanent establishment. It's a sort of the British equivalent of a sort of Dolchstoss legenda, a kind of stab in the back myth that it was the permanent elite that got in the way of implementing the Brexit that people wanted. I mean, personally, I would regard most of this as, I'm afraid, nonsense. There's very little evidence for it. And as you said in your opening clip, of course, many of the things that have happened since Brexit went against everything that the main Brexiteers promised, including, of course, the massive increase in net migration from outside the European Union, which was the exact opposite of what the Brexiteers claimed would happen after 2016.
So, to make matters very straightforward, is Nigel Farage's and other Reform UK members' message directed at the Conservative elites as well, or is it just the broad populist political elites, political establishment as such? So, in other words, does Farage go after people like Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and the likes of them?
I think he says he remains rather more fond of Boris Johnson than of many others, because they were in the end brothers in arms on fighting the Brexit process. But he says of the Conservative Party, indeed he said it at a major conference of right-wing thinkers here today with a lot of Trumpites present, that the Conservative Party was not a right-wing party, that the right of in the country was not split because you couldn't classify the Conservative Party as having done anything conservative in the last 14 years. And he's now pitching himself to Labour voters, above all in the Red Wall in the north, which is what Johnson so spectacularly won in 2019. He's pitching himself as the saviour of Brexit and the saviour of the country and the only man who can deliver genuine, radical Brexit reform. And that at the moment is working reasonably well for him. He's a consummate populist politician. He's riding high again because the Conservatives remain very unpopular after their 14 years in government. And the Labour Party has made a sort of uncertain, hesitant start and is becoming unpopular rather rapidly. So at the moment, reform is on the rise again as the same old arguments that we had before 2016 are wheeled out again.
It really sounds like the song we've heard all over again in different parts of the world just recently. Over to you, Ryan, and let's focus on the most central issue of the Leave campaign, which was migration. Brexit was supposed to bring back control primarily of the British borders, but as we see right now on the screen, we're displaying data showing that migration into the UK is not only high as it has ever been, but also we see an increase in the arrival of non-EU nationals, people from all over the world. How do the people of Britain square that?
Well, you could put another line on that chart, which would show the concern around immigration. And the architects of Brexit, one of the things that they promised was that the immigration issue in Britain would be put to bed. But for the reasons, the data that's on that chart, they simply haven't. Immigration, net migration is at an all-time high, and we face a huge challenge because the anxieties and grievances around immigration are real, and we need actual tangible solutions to them. Whereas Nigel Farage and the Reform Party are just prodding at these anxieties, and they're reaping political reward from it. At the Tony Blair Institute, we've actually recommended and suggested that the government look at a youth mobility scheme, because one of the things that's driving that migration is our labour market shortages, particularly in health and social care, and the increase in non-EU students coming to UK universities. Our sense is that a youth mobility scheme aimed at those under 30 that would give the freedom of movement to the UK and the right to work for a couple of years would start to address in a way that represented the ever-changing, evolving market conditions that would start to address some of those labour shortages, as well as obviously having the cultural benefits too. But the system we've got at the moment just isn't working. And you look as well at the number of dependents that come with non-EU migrants, it's much higher than what comes with EU migrants, which again presents a huge policy problem and not something that the people who voted for Brexit.
It absolutely looks like a very logical continuation, but logic isn't a strong suit of populist governments. Staying with you, Ryan, and playing the devil's advocate here a little bit. Reasonably, everyone would say it cannot be all that bad. So, provocatively, are there any sectors of the UK economy or the UK society that have benefited from the divorce with Brussels?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the recent declaration in France on artificial intelligence, and the UK made, in my view, a very sensible decision not to sign up to that. A recognition that regulation isn't always the right thing to pursue when it comes to innovative frontier technologies like AI. And I think Britain's got an opportunity to carve out its own path there. And look, the EU is far from perfect, but I think there is the reason why I'm optimistic having this conversation is because I think on both sides, on the UK side, there's a recognition that we need closer relationships with Europe, particularly around defence and on issues like climate, but also within the EU itself, a recognition that it needs to evolve and change. And I was really taken by the recent report from Mario Draghi, which I think set out the right course of action. And the big debate in the EU that needs to happen now is, do they pursue Draghi or not? And I think if they do, I think that opens up a really clear space for cooperation, for greater cooperation between Britain and the European Union, which certainly excites me.
A voice of optimism from you, Ryan, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to carry out that sentiment further in our conversation. I wanted to come back to you, Ivan, but before I ask a question, we wanted to display another piece of data. Voting intention concerning a possible second referendum on UK membership in the European Union, and we see clearly. This is from summer of last year, 56% of Britons willing to see or in favor of seeing Britain inside the European Union rather than on the outside of it. Are there any even remote chances of a second referendum on that matter?
In my view, not for the foreseeable future. Nobody is talking about it in any of the major parties, even the most pro-European party in the UK, the Liberal Democrats. or even amongst the Scottish nationalists. So it's a theoretical question. There's no appetite in the European Union to think about the question either of a future British accession, which would be extremely complex to do. So I think what Ryan outlined, which is the pragmatic agenda of how do you improve at a practical level relations, including on youth mobility, but it seems to me to go into multiple areas of security, not just defence and hard security and defence industrial cooperation, but energy security, climate security, the question of emissions trading schemes, the question of what we might do on a carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but lots of issues where, candidly, the UK and the EU are quite close to each other, and particularly even closer to each other, given we now have a Trump administration, have a lot of business they could be working on much more systematically together, but haven't been. So I think it's a pragmatic, medium-term agenda. Bear in mind that this government, although it's quite pro-European in orientation, has ruled out rejoining the single market. That's essentially because it can't do and won't do free movement of people, and it can't do rule-taking of the sort that Norway undertakes in the European Economic Area. And it's ruled out trying to recreate or trying to create a customs union. So as seen from the European Union, there are still red lines from the British government which look quite similar to the red lines of the Boris Johnson government. As I say, that does not rule out, in my view, quite significant pragmatic changes on multiple fronts which might be valuable to both sides, but will require a pretty complex negotiation over the next 2 to 3 years to get anywhere with.
So since you've mentioned the elephant in the room, Donald Trump, let's get to it. Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, announced in his op-ed over the weekend that Britain, should there be a need for it, could potentially be ready to deploy troops on the Ukrainian soil as part of the stabilizing force. How does Britain perceive itself vis-a-vis the United States right now, given this chaotic situation in which I think it's pretty much obvious that the current government in the United States has abandoned the transatlantic partnership?
Well, obviously, we, and no doubt you, profoundly hope they haven't abandoned the transatlantic partnership. But on the other hand, we all listened to J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, and we've all heard the messages from Elon Musk and others, and the orientation of this president with the withdrawal from many multilateral institutions and the undercutting of others. This will always preoccupy Britain because Britain has always seen itself as partway across the Atlantic, a bridge across the Atlantic between Europe and the US. We've always seen ourselves as having a special relationship. Some of this is mythology rather than reality, but some of it is true, and a close intelligence and security relationship. So I think there will be a very strong appetite from Keir Starmer to try and mend fences, try and keep the two sides together, try and ensure that the transatlantic relationship doesn't fall apart, and to play a constructive role on defence and security. The difficulty with that is it's not clear that this US administration is at all like previous US administrations and even the first Trump administration. And although the UK hopes not to be on the receiving end of tariff action, that hope might be disappointed given what the administration has already said about the impact of VAT. And we're a major player on VAT, as is the European Union. Mm-hmm. So we'll see.
A lot of these fears seem to be materializing already here on the continent. So on that note, back to you, Ryan, and I wanted to ask you about a possible scenario, because we already hear some mild voices of criticism on behalf of European partners that maybe Britain really wants to have the cake and still eat it, and that's not really something that the Europeans expect. And do you envision a situation in which Britain will be sort of squeezed between its willingness to remain a partner for the United States and the European countries forcing it to take a position of either or?
I think if you look at the current posture of the British Prime Minister, he has positioned himself as a conduit to the US. And when he took office, and when Donald Trump became president, there was a lot of criticism and fear in this country that bridges had been burnt. But actually, I think the government proved itself agile and nimble in terms of how it built that relationship with the US. And say what you want about President Trump, but he is someone who cuts and makes deals. And I think if there's a deal to be made and cut, he will take it. So what is that deal? I think we talk so much about areas of strategic cooperation between the UK and the EU, but it's the same for the US as well, and it is around defence. And I think the provocations of the president of the US around the things like defence spending and NATO, I don't want to throw those out wholesale. And I think what we've got to do is respond to them. And it takes us back to this question around what the relationship between the EU and the UK could be. I think there's a really important opportunity for us to take, which is to build a defence industry across the UK and the EU that, yes, meet some of the demands from President Trump around how much we spend. But if you look at Poland, you guys are racing ahead for your defence spending. You're at 4%. Britain's at 2.3%. I think we need to go higher.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
more than that, we need to embrace innovation. And as Ivan said, we really need to think about what the industry of defence looks like across Europe. And I think
apologies for interrupting, Ryan, but I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Seems that 5 years later, Brexit still remains what it always has been, a mixture of political fantasies and wishful thinking, which does not bode well for Britain, sadly, looking into the future. Ryan Wain, Ivan Rogers were our guests tonight. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Brexit referendum, with all its political features and consequences, will go down in history as the beginning of a major geopolitical reorientation. Populists promised voters heaven on earth and delivered almost nothing. One would hope that it would be a useful lesson. But hope alone, although necessary, is not in itself a survival strategy. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, just like the Trump administration, we will leave Europe behind and examine the balance of power in Asia. Make sure you're with us next Wednesday, and have a good evening.